Okay, so last few minutes. I try to keep it brief. Good luck with that. Anyway, cool. So last topic, I just want to touch upon a last option, of course, in terms of persistent storage on Android, which is often neglected, and I'm pretty sure that most of you probably not use it realistically, because it's really about having a dedicated means of data access only, independent of your application. That you want to manage. So for this purpose, you can really use content providers. So if you, so it's basically it. But you have seen a lot of means of abstraction already, and this is basically yet another one, right? So content providers are yet another layer of abstraction for data access. We know SQL. We saw Room right now as a higher level abstraction from relational databases. So it's called object relational mapping. So it's relational data. Content providers are different in a way that they don't make any assumptions about the data that's lying behind them, right? So it's an abstraction interface provided as an application component. It goes as far as you can basically ship them without an activity or a service per se. You could just ship the content provider, right? And another characteristic is also that many of the system level functionality in Android is provided in the form of a content provider, right? Guys know any example of a content provider? Standard example of a content provider in Android? Which probably is sensible across multiple apps.
Storage.
Yeah, that's right. That's one way. It's questionable, but the point is you kind of install it. I'm thinking more about a system-wide available content provider out of the box.
I was like wondering, is the content provider, is it an abstraction layer to access things on the phone itself, or no?
Anything.
Anything. So
that's the thing.
So accessing a camera, for example, on the phone.
That could be one way of doing it as well. Yeah. But the complex aspect there is that camera has a certain. You can model it this way, but it's rather complex a bit. But if you have data, for example, I'm thinking about contacts on the phone, right? So contact information is relevant across a wide range of different applications, right? So we have this contacts app on your phone or activity that you can actually access and review and change and so on different contexts. But actually, that's by no means the only functionality you can use it with. In fact, you can replace the contacts app, and hopefully, well, that's a bit of a stretch. Hopefully, it still works, without much modification to the rest of the system. So you don't need to worry about the contacts per se, as long as you comply to the abstraction layer basically, and you'll be able to access the same content provider using a different contact app, right? And that's why they actually quite happily work across different applications such as WhatsApp, Skype, whatever else, right? Whatever comes to mind, right? So, so I think it's important to learn about those. Whether you use them or not is a different story. But I think it's still worthwhile dealing with them. So, content provider. So since they are one of the 4 core application components, they of course also require explicit consideration in permission management, right? You'll see that if you're specifying the Android manifest, for example, you need to be explicit about functionality that's available and constraints associated with this. It's really useful if you're sharing data. That's the key thing. If you're sharing data amongst applications, so you want to make it accessible to multiple applications, and if you want to abstract from any sort of storage implementation, right? Whether you're accessing files, a database, of course. I mean, you can use it again to actually access a database, a web service. So coming back to the cloud idea, or whatever else you can think about. Content providers can be a pathway of doing that, right? So sometimes not 100% easy one if you look at the interfaces and the implementation, but it's made in a way to allow you abstract away any sort of data source, really. So it's basically the highest level call. So if you don't know what to use else, content provider may be a pathway, right? So, so you guys know all the different application components type, but this is one specific one associated with this. So the idea is basically that you have an application and you have potentially a content provider implementation as part of it, and that this may be well advertised across the operating system. So using a unique URL, you'll see that in a second how it's constructed, and allow other applications to access this content provider, right? So And what's sitting in the backend, if it's an SQL or an alternative storage mechanism, doesn't really matter. Please.
I was just seeing if I understand the content providers correctly. So I heard Jack Dorsey talked about using the iPhone's face recognition to make sure that it was an actual person using Twitter, but the Twitter app wouldn't get access to the face data. It would just get like an information if it was verified or not. Would that be a content provider? Like, or would that be more almost like a service?
Yeah, I mean, it has slightly different characteristics in a way, right? So the content provider as well, I mean, you can filter data, but one of the key things is that you, in principle, provide the data, whereas in your case...
Okay, it's just more like a bool.
Exactly. In your case, it would be more like it seems like an authentication or basically a classification tool, right? So it figures, I, as an application, just know yay or nay, is it a human or is it something else that's trying to identify, so I don't get the rich information. So I think the comparison is slightly off there, if you like, yeah. But fundamentally, the content provider would really think about it for now as a database, yeah? It's just that the structure of the database can be vastly different, right? It doesn't need to follow relational patterns or the like, but it can well be the images that you're actually taking from the camera, right? And then subjecting it to classification using a service or an activity, if we want to borrow that example you have just been highlighted. So that would be more the pathway. But you're right in a sense that it's an abstraction layer. Going out on a stretch here, I mean, you can probably app use content providers to facilitate something you have in mind, but I think wouldn't be the idiomatic use of them, right? It's really about managing data. But the neat part about it is, so if you have a unique, uniform interface in the form of the content provider, it doesn't really need to tell you anything about the underlying actual data store, right? So if you're using SQLite this week and using something else next week, no problem, right? So your activity or services relying on it and interacting with this will never be disturbed, right? Because you basically have a uniform interface, right? So that basically leverages high levels of abstraction compared to directly interacting with SQLite, for example, right? So, and that's the that's the main application of content providers here. So it provides, however, think about it. In fact, if you think about it for specification and invocation and so on, it has the feel of SQL, right? So if you interact with this, but it's not buying into the kind of same implementation form. More important, however, is that you have a unique identification of the components. So that's the scheme generator. So scheme content indicates the content provider, basically a protocol that's Android internal protocol refers to it as an application component of content provider. Then the authority, which is basically effectively your application, right? So the path you choose for your application when you package name in a widest sense in Java, right? So and a particular path if you want to differentiate for different kind of data sources. I mean, if you think about it in terms of different databases, right? So one focus on books, the other one focus on users, for example, right? So, and then the individual items can be addressed in a REST-like fashion that you have a unique identifier that you append to the actual path, right? So it could be, in this case, content, A to enter a new library /book /book1, right? Or 2 or 3 or 4. So you're kind of emulating a bit more, kind of a REST approach, basically. And then there's the content provider interface, which admittedly looks a bit like the SQLite interface, but only to some extent. Basically what it has is the CRUD operations that we had before, because you find them for anything, right? How to create an object, basically sending an object in as parameter, reading objects, so retrieving objects using some sort of identifier, updating and deleting them. But there's no implementation. So that's the key thing. It's just an interface. So it's for you guys basically to then, or for the implementer itself, to link it back to the actual storage implementation, which could be, of course, SQL, could also be a file system, and so on, right? So it could also be a file that is passed through the content provider, creating a file, reading a file, updating a file, and so on, right? So it's agnostic with respect to the content and the structure of it. Just the interface appears as if it's sending structured information. But again, the implementation is then up to you. So what you of course need to do is then this kind of content provider needs to be specified in the manifest as shown down here. So you have the name of it, you have the authority, again the middle path of this URI shown down there, and then certain other kind of options that you can set up. So it's quite a bit there. In fact, should it, for example, cover multiple authorities, meaning multiple applications potentially? Is it started before you actually log in? So will it boot will it start at boot time before any application starts? Perhaps application rely on this content provider, therefore it's high in priority. Enabled, accessible to other applications, and so on, right? A lot of stuff. Or for example, multiprocess is an interesting one in the sense that if you have multiple applications that rely on this content provider, do you instantiate multiple versions of it or not? Right? If you, for example, accessing a web service or cloud service, it probably makes sense to instantiate multiple versions because they may access different services and so on. But if they're, for example, accessing the same underlying database, it probably makes more sense to reduce it and keep it at one instance, because the bottleneck will ultimately be the database anyway, so it's no point having multiple content providers on top of it, right? So if you're engaging in multi-threading, for example, is also another aspect. And so on, right? So you can also specify the permissions that are required to use the content provider, right? You see right now it is much more on a higher level. It has a kind of a first-order citizen in the Android ecosystem in a sense that you can specify how this thing is going to be used by whom, right? In fact, by whoever, but under which conditions, meaning permissions, can you actually use this for your purpose, right? So it's quite straightforward if you just open Android Studio and you just extending, I believe, or implementing the content provider, you see the interface, and then it's just a matter of implementing it. The only thing that you will need to configure is the runtime properties. So that's roughly the idea there. So that's the most generic and therefore most constraining way of implementing storage functionality, persistence functionality in Android. In fact, it doesn't even need to be persistent, right? You could just keep everything in RAM and throw it away afterwards. No one would be concerned really, because the abstraction is so high. But the purpose, of course, is to have some sort of persistent storage sitting behind it. And if you link it to a cloud service, that's equally fine as if you are writing to file storage or whatever else, right? So quite straightforward. And the fundamental access is basically that you have an activity, of course, or something that resolves a content provider. So since a content provider, think about it a bit like an intent, right? So the intent would, if you have an activity in your sending an intent, it basically indicates or identifies the target activity or service, right? Intent, name of target activity, something like this, right? ContentResolver, same thing, basically, right? ContentResolver points to the content provider of choice, so identified by filter or by name in particular, by the URI, and then you can basically access the content provider contents, so it's bound basically to that request, and you can iterate through the content in a kind of SQL-like fashion again. So here's an example for the contact information, right? So we have a content resolver, see first line on top. So we get the reference to the content resolver, and then we can query for a particular content provider. So it's basically contact URI, which holds the URI for the content provider associated with the context of the operating system, of the operating system. So, and then within that, you're selecting the display name for individual contacts and leave all the other choices, the other fields unpopulated, basically, and execute this thing. So basically, access the content provider, return the display name for all returned contacts. Basically, that's the rough idea there, right? So that's kind of how it works if you want to access it. So quite straightforward, actually. So your task as implementer is just to provide this data in this kind of form and fashion. And of course, modify typing where sensible and necessary. If you want to update values equivalent, you kind of need to provide the unique identifier, the URI for the content provider, and then specify what you want to change, for example, right? So the content values in this example, and have some sort of where clause. And then here again, that's the key thing, the last line, have a content resolver that updates the content. And you see the structure has kind of this SQLite-ish fashion, unique identifier, content values, the where clause, and the actual values associated with the where statement. So here the placeholder values are bound to the question marks of the where clause again. similar as we saw earlier for the SQLite example, in order to update, for example, context here, right? So that's the key idea. So slight specialization of content providers, the file provider. So specifics here are that you are actually providing files as opposed to just any sort of data. So here it's about well, that's how we declared basically in the Android manifest. You just say provider, but focus on file provider specifically. And the advantage it basically gives you is it allows you to explicitly specify paths and files identifiers. So it's a lot easier from the application later on to access files this way, other than mucking around with the file system, right? So those are basically an abstraction from the file system. But the only thing that basically does, okay, anyone accessing this file provider can access those following files, but the actual location is managed from within this file provider itself. And of course, you can manage permissions as well, external paths, and so on. So if you feel that you need to share files across multiple activities, but want to obscure the underlying file system representation, then the file provider may be a pathway to going down as well. I'm not going into an example here in depth because it's something of, it's more like a configuration problem than a usage problem, really, I guess. Yeah. So is there anything else I wanted to say here? Yeah, you can specify the paths here, for example, and they can be specified in an XML resource that's attached to your project. So you're basically abstracting the whole challenges away. So yeah, and you specify, you're generating the UIs and embed them, provide permissions, and so on. And then you can use the UI that you have generated for this particular file provider in intents. So then you can actually requesting file content, for example, and have the file content returned to you if you address the file provider. So if you want to iterate through that, go through those 3 slides. They kind of sum up the essential path steps you need to do in order to use it in practice. But again, it's more like a specialization on the content provider, specific for files, though. Okay. There was a lot about persistence. The idea was really not so much to give you a deep insight, detailed insight to all of them, but rather to help you make advised choices in order to figure out when to use which one, or whether to use any of them, really. Perhaps you have another way of solution of dealing with this. But anyway, so we have quite a bit here in Android, actually, right? So if you have simple configurations, use shared preferences, key value, right, persistent. Private files, if you need private files and you don't want to muck around with permissions, and with dealing with exceptions, that is, for example, you don't have an external storage in your device, then the internal storage will just do. Mindful though, it may be deleted when your app is deleted. Then if you want to share data across multiple applications, of course, external storage is one way to go. If you are storing relational data in particular, SQLite is the way to go. But of course, it forces you to buy into the SQLite structure. If you have a bit more rich use of object-oriented capabilities, check out ORM in the form of the Room library. You can try it out as well. I think it doesn't hurt just to play around with it and see how it goes. And for anything else, then content providers, right? So that's the highest. I'm going from lowest to highest level of abstraction, basically. And yeah, so that's one pathway of doing it. I tried to put in a decision tree. I'm not sure if that's really a clever idea, but so the idea is basically if you have a non-persistent data, use bundles, persistent data, and they have a key value schema, you can go for share preferences. If you require change at runtime, then, or if you don't require change at runtime, you can use assets in your application development as well. If the data is private to the app and has a relational structure, you end up down in this lower left area where you can either choose between SQLite or whether if you want object relational mapping, go for Room. If you don't need a relational structure but want to keep the data private to the app, use internal storage. If you don't care about the privacy of the data but have structured data, use content providers. And if you don't already have structured data, then you are down to file providers or some use of external storage, because that's where you manage completely the structure in the nature of the data itself. So it's quite a rich set of options you can go through. And you can see as to what you actually need. Within the context of the individual assignments, I don't think you will need to exploit the feature set there, but with respect to your project, depending on the extent of it, it may be interesting perhaps to explore some more advanced persistence schemes that are available in Android And that's, again, just the overview of how to, which ones you can actually explore and perhaps use. Attached to that, of course, some resources. So there's basically nothing but the actual Android references to all those individual resources, but just collated in one slide set. Are there any questions regarding persistence in Android so far on this with this very broad overview at 3:45 in the afternoon?
A lot to take in right now.
Sorry?
There's a bit to take in right now.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite a bit of taking in right now, I know. It's very compressed, the whole idea. But that's the point. I mean, you have heard about shared preference already. You will hear more about SQL. So that's why I didn't spend any time on SQL, not much time on SQL talking about it. And some of the other concepts I will be touched upon as well. But it's really more to give you a big picture overview of what's available there, and perhaps guide you more in being aware that there's more than the few storage options out there that we discussed in class per se.
Like key value schema, you mean like more than just like simple numbers?
A key value schema would be like a map structure, right? So a key value, right? If every time you have a key value structure that is sensible for simple use, for example, configurations, classically, right? Unique identifier for a particular configuration feature, for example, in your application and so on, and then the value associated with brightness level, volume, right? So things like that, quite straightforward, right? Perhaps even choice of language. We get to that in a different session anyway when we talk about internationalization, but anytime you have a fixed schema of key value pairs, I think then you're down that route there. You don't need to push it further than having shared preferences, really, right? So, yep. No magic. I mean, it's just for you to dig in and have a look. I'll put those slides online, of course, so you can have a check there, check it out there, if you like. Marsh, did you want to say anything about assignment 1 or 2?
Any questions? There was one student asking a question, but I asked to post on the issue tracker, so I answered the question on the issue tracker. Any questions from you? Yeah?
In main activity, it says that the back button is supposed to quit the app. Should I override the back button to actually quit? Or is it okay with the native?
Yeah, use the native.
Okay.
Yeah, so don't override the, just call finish on the main activity and that's it. Yeah, you actually don't override it. Yeah, don't call finish. You don't call anything. It will behave like this out of the box. Yes, that's right. You have to call finish on the other ones to go back to the main, but not on the main. Yeah. And not in the back button. Only for when you get the data and you want to go back to the main one. The back button, don't override anything. Yeah. Use the native behavior. Yeah. Any other questions about assignment 1 or 2? Yeah, there was a question here whether you should handle portrait, orientation, and landscape. So in assignment 1, because we don't use persistence, what will happen if you rotate the phone? It will basically reset, right? So it will kind of start afresh. So you will lose the balances and everything. If you kind of halfway through your transaction, you kind of change the orientation of the phone. So, yep.
It kind of worked on the emulator, but I haven't tested it on the phone.
So
when I tilted it, it kept the balance. But
so if you rotated it, it kept the balance?
Yeah, but just on the emulator. So
yeah, but it...
That might have gone luck.
Yeah, maybe.
So test it, check how it behaves, and then do something, right? If you say it's a feature that you can reset your wallet by just turning the phone, that's
it's a stretch, right?
It's a bit of a push, right?
That's
yeah.
decent.
Okay, so we should make it not reset when we turn it 90 degrees.
Well, it's not specified, right? But you cannot really leave it to the default behavior, because the default behavior is a little bit kind of can be weird, right? So my suggestion is just to use the bundle to save the state and restore the state on the new orientation. So you kind of persist the state of the app through the rotations, right? That's the simplest way, right? And that basically is the proper way of handling the orientation change if you're not changing the layouts or doing anything tricky, right? Before the app will shut down, before the activity is shut down because of the orientation change, you can store the data that you need to restore in the bundle, and then upon the new on start, you will have the on instance safe bundle back, and you can restore the state. So use that. It's not in the spec, right? So if you come up with a more creative way of dealing with it, which we haven't foreseen, and you can argue for it, that's fine. If you leave it to the default behavior, that's probably not that great. And you cannot use persistence, so cannot dump stuff into properties or disk, right? Yeah, that is written in the spec. That persistence is not allowed.
For transaction sensitivity,
Yeah.
selecting short click on the item list has no effect, but it should be allowed. I don't understand what that means. What should I do?
Yeah, I will have a look.
It gives specific what you do on a long click, but not on short click. So.
Let me just check. Very quickly, as soon as the network gets back to me. All right. So it says selecting short click on the list items has no effect, but users should be allowed to select a single item. So you're asking about that one?
Yeah. What am I supposed to do?
So the items should be selectable, but only one can be selected. So no multi-select, just one selection, right? So if you have a list, sometimes you may want, like, you have a list and you want to delete a transaction, right? Or delete 3 transactions. So in multi-select, you can kind of tap on 3, select 3, and have 3 selected. But we want just a single select list. So the behavior is that the list is only once item can be selected. So it's kind of highlighted, yeah.
My current implementation is just that if you take a short click, nothing happens. But if you take a long click, it gets the toast you're supposed to get. Should we add something on the short one?
No, then it's fine. Yeah, yeah. There was a discussion on the issue tracker about doing the long click handling with the recycler view. Check the discussion, and there will be a tutorial, not this week but next week, about the recycler view and handling long and short clicks.
I think
so
I'm the one who made that issue. I didn't resolve it.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, there was no a complete solution, but there was a kind of a discussion of what can and cannot be used. So yeah, it might be valuable. And to see the previous issues, you just say, I want to see all the issues, not only the open ones. So then you can browse the history. Yeah. Any other questions about the assignment 1? Most of the things have been kind of already filtered. So I think it's more or less fine. Assignment 2 hasn't been vetted that well, so there will be a little bit of a changes to the lab 2 in terms of some of the details, but nothing major. Yeah, the logic will stay the same. Yeah, so maybe I quickly talk about those two questions which were asked. So one question which was asked was how to test the behavior of the timer without overloading the external APIs. So if I say I want to check the feeds every 10 seconds, it actually violates a lot of user agreements about fetching the APIs that frequently, right? Of course, you should never test the application with the live, server, with the live fetching of stuff. You should always mock it. So we will have a lecture about testing and mocking the external dependencies, but the general idea is that in your app, you request some feed, some atom feed, but the request actually doesn't go to the proper URL. It goes to like a mock, which gives you back a mocked data, and then you parse it, and then you process it, and then you show what happened, right? And if you want to test the timer, then you kind of wait certain amount of time to see if something happened, if the request came in, and then if the request came in, that means that the timer is asking every time, right? So you're not testing the processing, you're not testing going into a network, you're just testing if the timer is kicking in now and then, right? So there is like a test which waits for something to happen within a certain time frame. You don't have to have those tests. So that the functionality test of something being kicked in within the timer, it's not such a crucial thing. Parsing and processing the data is. So I'd rather have you testing that part. And again, you do it with the mock. You don't do it with the real data. I often do fetch it manually, like using Postman or something, and I'm actually preparing a test with the real data, kind of hard-coded into a test case, right? So I'm not fetching it from the real server, but I'm using a real JSON or real XML to kind of see if my software properly parses it and processes it and extracts the data that I need. So you can do the same pattern. And the second question was, so one was about the timer tests, and the other one was about whether opening a browser with the URL is okay, or whether you should embed the web view into your own application and show that, right? I want to leave it to the developers. I don't care, right? If you feel opening a browser and having the view from within the browser is okay, then have it handled like this. Or if you want to embed a web view into your own UI as a fragment and have it kind of as part of the fragment, have it this way, right? The advantage of using your web view as a fragment is that you can have a list of articles and the web view next to each other, right? You cannot do that with the external browser. The browser will always occupy the entire screen, right? So managing the display of the articles in the web view, which is part of your UI, has a lot of benefits. And it was kind of implied that it will be like this. But if you have a strong preference of doing an external browser thing, you can. And on the mobile phone, it may not really feel that different, right? Up to you. So that part, I don't want to specify exactly how you should do it. You can argue for one way of doing it or the other. If I were doing it, I would probably use WebView as part of my UI, because then I have more control of how I'm managing that, instead of firing up a separate browser window for just displaying the article. But yeah, it's up for the implementation. So hopefully those two questions will be asked again on the issue tracker, and then I basically answer the same way. Yeah. Yeah, so a reminder that the lecture is tomorrow, and then the practical session is on Thursday.
Mentioned already.
And we're covering SQL Lite.
Where?
On Thursday.
Yep.
There's a random question.
Yep.
If you want to publish the app on Android, does Google vet